Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this Saturday morning. We're welcome for allemaal. I see there are a lot of people from out of Cape Town, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Daiyaan Petersen. He is a UCT graduate in the environmental sciences, and he's busy now at the present moment with a postgraduate course. He's taken over from Ebrahim Ruda, who some of you may know, who was a very keen researcher, and he's now the current chair of the CFRF. Now, if you go and Google that, it doesn't mean it's the Climate Financial Rush Forum nor the Climate Fisheries Research Foundation, but the Cape Family Research Forum. He has written a book, and he's done extensive research in the archives in Cape Town. My friend Kami notes that he's a micro-historian and seasoned archive researcher. He has been recognized by Professor Lafkin at Princeton University and by Safich Norton. And without any further ado, I'm going to ask him to continue with his presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my talk this morning, my presentation rather, Tracing Without a Trace, Searching for Your Ancestors Without Conventional Registrations. Just an introduction to myself. Just firstly, I have never written a book. I have written some short pieces that have been shared and sometimes published, but hopefully a book might be coming sometime soon, but not yet. In terms of my studies, David has mentioned, I am an honors student in the Environmental and Geographical Science Department at UCT, and my research focus is on urbanism, urban development, analysis of discourse, and so on. And my research interests, separate to my actual studies, obviously include genealogy, being here today, Islam at the Cape, slavery, political exile, and recently, I didn't want to put it on here, but recently the occult. And as we go through presentation, I will be touching on this point of the occult. I'm not talking about doing seances to try and contact your deceased relatives, but rather, looking at the practices of texts in the community dealing with this and how this can also sometimes inform our search for our ancestors in our genealogy. So, just a table of contents, what we're going to be going through today. I will be discussing the archive itself and looking at the dichotomy of formal and informal sources. I'll also be looking at some methods used for research, which include general desktop research for most people that do not have access to a physical archive or library of sorts. This is probably the most used resource or research type that you use. And then, of course, field research, in inverted commas, we'll be exploring that. And then I've also got 2 case studies that I'll be going through just to demonstrate the use of all these sources and the use of these methods in tracing without a trace, essentially. So just in terms of the archives, what is an archive? What type of archives do we use? And, how does the concept of the archive also inform how we are able to do our genealogical research? There exists this dichotomy within the concept of the archive, which is the informal archive and the formal archive. So for most of us, we all generally use the formal archive to do our research. It is the most reliable, the most accurate, and probably the most detailed, I would say. And examples of these archives include, locally here in Cape Town, we've got the Western Cape Archives and Records Services, which is number 72 Ruland Street. Obviously, the National Archives in Pretoria, many archives throughout the country. There are church archives, libraries are included in this, sometimes special collections. I know at the Brenthurst Gallery in Johannesburg, they've also got a formal archive where they've got a whole lot of photographs of the Old Cape and Old South Africa, a whole lot of writing about South Africa and, various other topics, but a lot of it is, formalized, structured into the traditional sense of the archive. And then that then brings us to the informal archive. What is the informal archive, and how does this inform our research in trying to unpack our genealogy? My understanding of the informal archive in this context includes family books that are passed down. It includes graveyards, which we will be exploring, and it also includes different types of oral history. The point that had slipped my mind earlier is that my talk will be in the context of slavery at the Cape and Islam at the Cape, particularly because it's my specific research interest, but also in terms of the topic of this talk, tracing without a trace. For most free people, I would say there are usually, many records, formal registrations that exist to trace their genealogy. But for the enslaved and for the previously enslaved, we have to use alternative sources to try and trace their genealogy. And then I also just want to speak about perception of people in these different archives. And I'd like to use the case of a slave woman, or a previously enslaved woman by the name of Rosetta van der Kaap. I had done some research on her, and I came across a death notice for her. We will be obviously exploring that as we move on, but I came across a death notice for her, where she's just termed in the archive, or the colonial formal archive, as a slave woman, and she had died in 1842. Yet slavery had ended already by 1838, right? So we are now around 4 years after slavery, and she's still being termed as a slave woman. This is in the formal archive. But when you go to the old burial ground where a lot of the old slaves and Muslims are buried in the Tanabaru in Bo-Kaap, I actually managed to find her tombstone. And on the tombstone, it actually, there are two terms that are used. The first is وَصَاحِبُ هَذَا الْقُبُورِ, the owner of this grave, and the second is Nyai Rosetta, Harimat Enchi Adolf. So in terms of the first term, وَصَاحِبُ هَذَا الْقَبْرِ, it describes as being the owner of this grave, right? So this then strikes an image in your mind of, she then owns something in her life, which is contrasting to the colonial perception of herself actually being owned, despite being free by that time already. She's still conceived, or perceived rather, as being owned. Yet, from the perspective of the community that she finds herself in, and using the informal archive of the tombstone, we can see that she is viewed as an owner of land. And in our community, we say, tot die dag van Kiyama, till the day of reckoning, or the day of judgment, she will be the owner of that grave, and nobody can take that away from her. Secondly, on her death notice, she's also listed as a housemaid, right? And we know, some of the politics around that, especially in, contemporary research and so on, of being a housemaid. And that was what she was termed as on her death notice, as an occupation. Yet, when we look at the tombstone again, she's given a title of Nyai. Nyai is an old Malay word, varying from concubine all the way to a highly respected woman. And the use of Nyai in this context places her on a pedestal as an older, respected woman in the colony. Nyai is also, according to some etymologies, where we get the Afrikaans word noi from as well. So, oh noi, and so on. But it's this use of the term Nyai, that creates this image of your mind, or in your mind, of a highly respected woman. And again, we look at this contrast between a described housemaid in the formal archive, yet an honored woman in the informal archive. And this is just an example of, how they are perceived within their communities. But using these ways of thinking also allows us to, also aids us in our research. For example, the knowledge that she was a slave woman, as well as the knowledge of her being a respected mother and grandmother in the community, eventually led me to find her the slave register of her owner, where she is listed, her daughter and son are listed, as well as her grandchildren. So three generations of slaves um, in one on one slave register, which over time I eventually managed to trace the descendants um, and so on. So just coming to some formal sources that I use particularly in my research. As I mentioned, the talk is in the context of the Cape and context of Islam and slavery. Um, and so the source or the type of archive that I use the most is the WCARS, the Western Cape Archives and Record Services, which is a formal archive, as I had mentioned earlier. And some of the main sources that I use are the ones on the screen, which I will go through now. Just when we think of sources, um, I'd just like you to think of it as different departments. So we've got the old colonial um, governing systems, whether it be the Dutch or the British, and then after that we had the apartheid, and now we've got democracy. There are different departments in the government which do different things. And so because they do different things, they also reflect different things. Um, and we will be exploring some of those things now. I also don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence. I know um, the GGSA is, it's a veteran, seasoned genealogists, best in the country. But I just thought, it's best to include everything for my own sake to try and, go through a good system. But also the fact that I had invited quite a number of people that are not familiar with archival research, and I think likewise as well. So in terms of these formal sources or sources from the formal archive that I make use of, most South African or at least Cape genealogists will be familiar with the MWC source. MWC stands for Master's Office of the Orphan Chambers. And this goes back to the period of the Dutch, where there were a whole lot of orphans running around at the Cape. And they needed a way to try to dispose of the assets of their parents to take care of these orphans. And so they established the Master's Office of the Orphan Chambers. And the descendant of this today is the Master's Office that we all go um, to sort out our estate files and so on. So in this Master's Office, I would say the most crucial document um, for genealogists in South Africa, at least, is the death notice. Um, Compared to every other document, source, reference, this is probably the most detailed document that you would find. And generally, not all the time, but generally, you would find three generations of one family, and sometimes even four on one death notice. So it starts off um, with the name of the individual that has died, where they were born, their age, their occupation, the names of their parents. So that's two generations, themselves, their parents. And then they've also got the names of their heirs or their children. Um, and in some cases, I've actually seen quite a number of cases where whether the children have died, uh, so their grandchildren are listed, or if grandchildren are just listed as an heir as well, the grandchildren would be included too. And so here we see four generations, 3 to 4 generations of one family included on one document. Of course, this is not always the case. If you happen to die at the old Somerset Hospital, for example, no matter who you were, oftentimes, there would be absolutely no information. It's just the name of the individual. Sometimes all the other information is just left out. Age, not known. Name of parents, not known. Place of birth, not known. Any assets, not known. And so it's quite frustrating when you go through a lot of research, you find a nice reference for a death notice, you go to the death notice, and then it's empty. You've only got the name which is on the reference in the first place. The second volume of documents in the NWC source are your wills. And I'm sure most of you today obviously know what a will is. It's a document um, detailing, the how your assets will be distributed after your death. And generally in wills, um, we see the names of heirs included, whether it be blood heirs, um, sorry, whether it be blood heirs, whether it be children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, friends, and so on. In the context of slavery, where previously enslaved people, or free blacks as they are termed, when they had submitted wills to the master's office, because some of them did not have children, some of their children have still been enslaved, um, they formed their own kinship system at the Cape when they had come. And so you see them nominating other unrelated free blacks or previously enslaved people as heirs to their wills. You also see them nominating them as executors as well. And so when using the wills, sometimes the children are not mentioned. It just says that it should go to their heirs, whether they are mondig or onmondig, whether they are minor or major heirs, but sometimes the names are not added. Um, However, within the mention of the executors, then they would actually then mention a child or two if they chose their children as executors. So that is sometimes helpful as well. Again, in the context of the free blacks, um, you also start to notice that because they had formed their own kinship, um, marriage would then occur at the next generation. And so you can sometimes use those names and try and trace down and see if names match, um, if there is this connection. So you have to use a lot of informal ways of thinking when dealing with some of these documents because of the situation at the time. The third primary source, I would say, are your liquidation and distribution accounts. Generally, if you have an L&D account, you would also have a will and a death notice, but not always. I've seen people with only one of the three or two of the three, and these are also um, valuable in that, let's say children were not mentioned in the will, but in the L&D account, they would then mention the exact names of the children and who gets what. Um, then we've got MOIB. MOIB is Master's Office Insolvency Branch. So it's like a subsection of your MWCs. And basically, this is an L&D account in your lifetime. When you've gone insolvent and they now need to round up your um, assets and distribute them to pay off all of your debts. And we actually then start to notice that in insolvency accounts, um, people start to list household items and money as being belonging to their children or their parents or their siblings or close friends, so that it's not taken and distributed, and it was a way to keep it. And so many people that went insolvent did not have an estate, and so there was no death notice, there was no will, there was no L&D account, right? And so for people like this that almost disappear into the archives, we've got this MOIB as a backup to check, the names of children and relatives if mentioned. The third most common source, and this one I'm going to glean over because I think we use this one the most, are your birth, marriage, and death registers, and these start with the formalization of registration in 1895. It was then law to register a birth and a death. Marriage, had occurred previously, and so 99% of the time, if you died in South Africa, you would have or if you were born after 1895 and if you died after 1895, you would have a certificate for these two. However, in the early days, there were quite a number of people that managed to dodge this. They didn't see the importance of registering. And so, again, these people also just disappear from documents. In terms of marriage, um, although it was a I would say a government source at the time, many of the churches also officiated the marriages, and so you would find those in church records, as I will speak about later. But it's important to note that in other communities that had existed at the Cape, particularly among slaves, whether Muslim or not, if they had their own um, uh, marriage cultures or marriage rights, they were not recognized at the time. And so there is no record at all of their marriage. Um, However, you then spot in the wills and on death notices sometimes, particularly of Muslims, it would say that they were married according to Mohammedan rites. And so this is sometimes the proof of their marriage at the time. So I mentioned that birth and death started 1895. However, we do have quite a number of ward masters returns, right? Um, Ward masters, if we think of till today, we've got our wards that we live in, that we vote in. We've got our ward councillor. In those days, they also had their wards, and so if we think of the ward councillor as um, the ward master before 1895 would record some, not all, but some births and deaths in their ward at the time, and it was mostly in Cape Town Central, so the CBD today, including De Waterkant, Greenpoint, Poorkaap, District 6. There were also some returns for Claremont and Wynberg in Cape Town, and I think I did spot a number in Johannesburg as well, but I can't remember the exact areas. But these ward masters returns, the earliest that I could find were from the 1840s. We start to see quite a number of birth registrations. That is, quite helpful in the absence of the HAWC, or sorry, I meant to say HAWC stands for Home Affairs Western Cape. There's Home Affairs Eastern Cape, Home Affairs Northern Cape, and so on. But these ward master returns predates the birth registrations and some death registrations as well by like 50 years. So it's quite helpful. There were also earlier sources. I think it was in Colonial Office where we see some very early birth registrations in the 1790s and 1800s, and some death registrations as well. But it's scattered. Not everybody was included, and so on. But obviously worthwhile going through these lists, if you are that keen to trace your genealogy. Next up, we've got the Colonial Office. This is under the British period, and a nice example I like to give, I think I actually learned this from Mr. Hanif Kamadin, is that, if we think of the Colonial Office, it was the same guy that put Lawrence in Arabia. It was the same people that were set up in Hong Kong, Singapore. It's, I don't want to say the representative of the British in those countries, but it was sort of an administrative office that sat in all of the colonies around the world. And so at the Cape, we've got our Colonial Office. The earliest sources actually date back to pre-British invasion, so even before 1795. But for the most part, the Colonial Office starts from around 1806. And in terms of genealogical research that I myself have used, are memorials. We can think of memorials as letters or sometimes reports to the Colonial Office. Sometimes there are requests to leave and enter the colony. You've also got some petitions in the Colonial Office, and I'll actually bring up some images that I took in some of my research, where you can see how these Colonial Office documents can inform our research. We've then got the Raad der Gemeente, which is sort of like a civic board at the time. I'm just trying to think of, what is the best way. I'm not sure. Some old Dutch specialists in the audience could provide, the best translation of that. But it was sort of a council, a civic council of sorts, and it was based mostly, in the city itself, in the metropolitan. Um, and there were quite a number of things that they did, and some of the source, or some of the volumes in the RDG source include civic census. So within the municipality, then they would do a census of all the people living there. Um, there are also quite a number of license applications. These are found actually quite useful to see where people were living, what they were doing at the time, particularly because there were a number of free blacks or freed slaves with the same names. And so these you could tell where they lived and their occupation at the time to be able to determine which free black was which, for example. There was a freed slave there were 2 or 3 freed slaves by the name of Abdul Sukur. Um, and I actually had gotten confused because they were all in the same area, but it's from these, license applications that I was able to pinpoint that the primary or the most active Abdul Sukur was one that had lived in Plain Street, so just up from the gardens, and he had kept, I think it was a trading license at the time, and then later on he actually went on to found, let's say, the oldest company in the Cape Muslim community, which was a horse and cart company, or business that was started in 1816 and had continued well into the 1900s. A lot of people in the Cape Town community will remember the Sukur horse and carts that used to ride up and down in the city. You've also got some slave manumissions in the RDG. Um, those are quite helpful. Sometimes lists the names of slaves' children or their parents, or sometimes who they cohabited with because their marriages weren't recognized. And then we've also got free black returns, which is similar to the civic census, but it details specifically who the free blacks were that were either in the colony or in the municipality at the time. The RDG source, I just like to credit that to Mr. Ibrahim Roode. In many, I think in his books and in some of his talks, he references RDG quite a lot. And I decided to explore it, and I managed to find, all of these different documents in there. We've then got the Cape Supreme Court, and in there you've got the court cases, and those are always helpful. Sometimes families involved, people owe money, they need to find a next of kin, or they can't find the person, they have to find their sibling to deliver papers to. The little gems in court cases sometimes are helpful. Then there are the opgafrollen, which are in the J source. Opgafrollen are taxation census. So if you owned anything, even yourself, sometimes, then you would appear on this taxation roll, and you're able to determine where people lived at the time. You can determine sometimes in their household how many people there were. So you can say by the 1820s, we know it was a family of 5, by then, and you can use those numbers to try and work out, some names that fit and don't fit. Sometimes children are mentioned, spouses are mentioned, how many goats, bokken they owned, the size of their plots or their farm, how many slaves they owned, how many free blacks lived on their property. There's a lot of information that you can gather from these opgafrollen, and it proved to be quite useful to me. Then we've got the slave office. The slave office was established in around 1816 during the British period. Before this, many people could own slaves, and there were records of the transactions of these slaves, but no formal record of every slave in the colony. And by 1816, it then became law that you had to register every slave that you owned. And so when I was speaking about Rosetta earlier, the slave registrations, it's in this slave office that we find these slave registers mentioning all the slaves owned by these people at the time. There's also fascinating that even people that had previously been enslaved, or free blacks, had slaves as well. And within the slave office, there's a section just for free black slave owners themselves. And you can see all the slaves that they owned. Um, Oftentimes, the free blacks would manumit slaves. So, because they come from the community of slaves, they've got relatives, sometimes children, parents, siblings, um, close friends that are still enslaved, and they would purchase their relatives um, and manumit them or free them. And so we see these manumission certificates and manumission registers in the slave office. And again, incredibly helpful in tracing, a familial connection between people. And then lastly, in the archival, Western Cape archival sources are your CJ files. The CJ is the Court of Justice. Um, and within the Court of Justice, although you've got wills in your MWC, you've also got wills that were registered as notarial wills with a notary in the Court of Justice. They would have to go to the castle, to the notary. The notary will write it up. And sometimes it's a carbon copy of the MWC will, because it was in the same period. And other times, there's sometimes more information or less information. But it's always useful to have these, secondary documents to try and substantiate, back up, or look at the comparison between the two. In the CJ, we've also got fines. Particularly, I work with the slave fines. These were usually punishments that were meted out to the slaves or the free blacks. And again, similarly to the Cape Supreme Court court cases, in the CJ fines, you also see mention, sometimes of relatives and so on. In the CJ, you've also got church pensions that are sometimes mentioned. You also find that in the colonial office, which I might be showing one of those soon. Again, you've got court cases. The CJ was essentially the courts during the period of the Dutch, right? So after the Dutch had left, the CJ, Court of Justice, had ceased at the Cape, and then the CSC, sprung up. And then the last source in the CJ and at the archives that I'll be speaking about is your Banditenrollen. So the Banditenrollen are the registers or reports of banditen or convicts that were at the Cape. And a more contemporary term for these convicts are political exiles. Some of them were convicts in the sense of, having committed actual crimes, petty crimes, and had been sent to the Cape, or sent from Cape Town to Robben Island. And others of them were political advisors, sometimes royalty, sultans, princes, that were exiled from their places of origin, and then exiled to the Cape, to Robben Island. And there are a number of families or relatives listed on these Banditenrollen. For example, if we analyze it, we'll see like a few names bunched together coming on the same date from the same place. And sometimes that actually denotes that they were brothers or relatives, or parents and children, and so on, for whatever the reason was for them being exiled to the Cape. I know it's quite a lot to take in. It's a lot of information. It's quite dense in terms of the sources and the details. But for me, I just find it so fascinating, that they, despite being a lack of formal registration per se, in terms of death, birth, wills, there are all these other documents that we can scour through to try and find documents. Next, in our formal sources that exclude the Western Cape archives, or whatever archive you're dealing with, we've got our newspaper sources. Early newspapers include the Suid-Afrikaan, the Cape Standard, the Cape Times, Cape Argus, and the Cape Town Gazette, and I think Commercial Advertiser, what it was called. And in all of these newspapers, early newspapers, all of them are post 1800, but there's a lot of information in these newspapers. Sometimes you can't make it to an archive, but the newspaper scans are online, and there you actually find summaries of the court cases in a lot of these newspapers, like the Cape Times and Cape Standard. There's a lot of notices of birth and death. Like I mentioned, registration starts 1895 of birth and death, yet in the newspapers before this, there will be obituaries for people that had died. There will also be announcements of baptisms, births, marriages, and so on. In the Muslim community, because there was no formal system of marriage registration, in newspapers is actually where we find articles written about it is very, to use Edward Said's term, Orientalist, in how these people and how their weddings were described. But nonetheless, there is, a lot of detail in the newspapers of, who was getting married, who the parents of the bride and groom were, whose house it took place in, who was the officiating priest or imam at the time. Even as far as there was one article I saw listing all of the bridesmaids, and I had gone to I think a descendant of the married couple, and this aunt could actually say, this bridesmaid was my granny's cousin, and that one was her sister, and so on. So we can see, putting these sources together to tell the full story. We've also got the almanacs, and there were a number of them, but they essentially did the same thing. There was the South African Almanac and Directory, the Port Elizabeth Directory and Guide to the Eastern Province, General Directory and Guidebook to Cape of Good Hope, and a few others, I think. And I've actually got a few here. Obviously you can't really see well now, but there was a lot of information just to read through. It comprised of a complete list of civil, judicial, and church establishments, the names of inhabitants of Stellenbosch and Paarl, revenue and expenditure of the colony, salaries of the public servants, a guide to strangers visiting the Cape. But I think the most important thing that I use particularly in these almanacs are the Cape Town and Suburbs Directory. And it's in these directories that you find the names of all people that had some sort of income, whether it was a cooper or a tailor, a translator, even menial things like water carriers. All of these people were listed in these almanacs. And for the most part, not every time, but for the most part, where they had lived. And so similarly to those licenses that I had mentioned earlier, where you can tell people with the same names, but differentiating them by the occupation and where they lived, really assists in trying to unpack their story. So those are the almanacs. And then lastly, church records. I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with church records, your baptisms, memberships, sometimes pensions and marriages. And these were mostly from the Dutch Reformed Church and Anglican Church. There are documents that sit in the Lutheran Church in Strand Street in Cape Town, but it's in a vault and it's largely inaccessible unless you actually go there and make an appointment. And I was told again by Mr. Kamadin that there are a number of Muslim marriages that were recorded at the time in the Lutheran Church because of the treatment of the Lutheran Church at the time, in that prior to 1806, only the Dutch Reformed Church was tolerated at the Cape, from a legal sense. And so the Lutheran Church wasn't, I don't want to say it was illegal, but it didn't quite have the same status as the Dutch Reformed Church. And so there was a sense of an affinity between marriage by Malay rites and marriage within the Lutheran Church. In fact, you find quite a number of early German immigrants. When I say early, I say early 19th century and late 18th century German immigrants at the Cape, taking concubines from the free black and sometimes Malay community. and you see these being reported in the Lutheran Church. This then brings us to our informal sources. I had basically covered all of the formal sources that I particularly work with. Of course, those are limited to my research. I'm sure many of the genealogists, that are tuned in today, use other sources in, formal archives in their research, but those are just the main ones that I use in my research. But these informal sources include family heirlooms. So you'll find Bibles in Bibles, either in the front or sometimes in the back. There's a section for family trees that are, put into the Bibles. There are also talismans. These talismans, particularly in what we call the Cape Malay or Cape Muslim community, are books on the occult. The early Muslim community had practiced what we term today in the Cape as dukum, a kind of sometimes white or black magic. A lot of it was for healing purposes. In fact, 99% was for healing purposes and meaning making at the Cape. They found themselves in a strange place, and this this artifact or this culture from back home, allows them to make meaning of this new space that they find themselves in, particularly in terms of, direction, geography, and so on. If anyone's interested, they're welcome to contact me about this, and I can speak quite a bit about, the use of Islamicate occult at the Cape. But in these talismans, in the early community, there was a sense that certain names were auspicious, right? And we see lists where different names are to be named on different days, in different months, and so on. And so we can use these talismans to try to unpack some of these names to get dates, or sometimes some of the dates to get names, to infer relation between people. It was quite a complex system. They had their own calendar, which I term slave science, at the Cape, which was quite fascinating. In fact, my honors thesis is based on the slave science and this calendar at the Cape. You've also got diaries that feature in many families. There are also journals that are in many families. Then you've got kitabs. Kitabs in the Muslim community are books, either religious or non-religious, comprising of all the previous above ones. Sometimes copies of handwritten Qur'ans that had been passed down, talismans sometimes. Sometimes there are drawings, sometimes religious instruction, so not quite a Quran, but just detailing how the religion is meant to be practiced. Sometimes something called Mawlud. A Mawlud was the celebration of the birth of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in all of these kitabs, oftentimes, either both or one of the two, the scribe and the owner's name featured in these kitabs. In my family, we've got a number of these kitabs, and I think in one of them, a distant ancestor of mine actually wrote his ancestry up to 7 generations, right? So when I opened the page, I'd visited a relative of mine who is the custodian of these kitabs, and I had opened the page and I saw in Arabic he had written his name as Hashim, son of Hashim, son of Abdul Wahab, son of Hiji, son of Wastin, son of Abdul Rahman. So there we've got like 7 generations of one family, and I was never able to trace some of these names in the archive, but just from family heirlooms, kitabs, do we have some of the oral history, tracing us back to these ancestors. And speaking to other family relatives, some of the stories were that we come from a Javanese prince that was sent to the Cape. And in these Bandit and Roland that I mentioned earlier, there's a set called the Robben Island Registers, and there are a number of Abdurrahmans mentioned there. So it might well be that this Abdurrahman that my great-great uncle had written in this kitab is the very same Abdurrahman that appears, on this Banditen roll at the time. Moving on, another informal source are cemeteries, graveyards, burial grounds, and I have mentioned it before, but tombstones are, very useful sometimes in our search. Not just as genealogists, we want to know where our ancestors are buried, because we feel some sort of affinity to them, I guess. But also sometimes full names, sometimes nicknames, sometimes more accurately dates of birth and death, spouses. On some we even find names of children, you know, um, on these tombstones, but it's quite useful in our search. And then Jawi Mesang. So Jawi is the Malay language written in the Arabic script, and a Mesang or Mesangsteen in the Cape Muslim community refers to a tombstone, a headstone, right? So these Jawi Mesangs are actually found throughout the Cape, in Simonstown, in Bo-Kaap, in Worcester, in Kimberley, um, in Claremont, in Wynberg, throughout the Cape, wherever Muslims had found themselves and formed a community, they set up a place of worship, which is called a langer, which is an informal mosque of sorts. And they also set up a burial ground for themselves. Like in many church, you've got your congregational burial ground. For Muslims, we've also got a similar thing, but more broader for Muslims in general. Um, and it's in these uh, burial grounds, or as we say in our community, the kubus, that we find these Jawi Mesangs. And these all date to um, the early 19th century onwards. It then goes out of fashion in, I would say, mid to late 19th century, and you actually start to see Arabic Afrikaans mesangs or tombstones popping up, sometimes pure Arabic, sometimes Dutch or later Afrikaans, and then till today we see English tombstones surviving. But using the skill of knowing the Malay language, being able to read Arabic Afrikaans or Arabic, um, can sometimes assist, not sometimes, oftentimes assist in translating these tombstones, particularly when researching the enslaved community. And then finally, in our informal sources, we've got oral history. And I think this is, for most people around the world, in terms of their genealogy, the closest they come is the oral history, particularly family law stories that are passed down in family gatherings, sometimes speaking to granny, grandpa, auntie, uncle, and so on, and it just starts to come out. Um, and then I included bedtime stories as a second um, source under oral history, particularly because of my own experience. I had grown up with great grandparents around me in the house, and apart from family law being told in our community of the Baumgardt or Baumgardt family, which I will be using as a case study. Apart from the family law, um, when they put me to bed, they would also tell me other stories that sometimes weren't told in the family law because they were particular to bedtime, and these also sometimes can contribute to one's genealogy. Um, Examples of like some bedtime stories that I was told by my late great grandfather. I actually cannot remember them, but one was about he was born in Freiburg, and I'm not sure if it was a memory of his or told by his mother, but it was about a farm worker up north or on the farm, wherever it was. Um, and this boy would walk past the farmer's house every day, and as he walks past, he shouts, "Trek wyfie, osse," and he would run away, and the farmer would run out and shout at him, and so on. Um, and there was more to the story. I can't remember anymore, unfortunately. I was too young to know that I was interested in genealogy. But these stories passed down, tell us the things that our ancestors were involved in. And so I know that from my great grandfather's side, his maternal grandmother came from a previously enslaved community, and it's likely that perhaps her father or grandfather was a laborer or a worker or a groom of horses, and perhaps it was he himself that used to shout this, and he used to tell his kids, and it passed down like that. And now we've got these stories of our ancestors, what they used to do. Um, Another is a story, and if my family's tuned in, they will either laugh or get quite scared. But my great grandmother and the sister used to tell the story of Mama Rokala. I have no idea what it is, but it seems to be a Malay story um, of this. Uh, I think it's a woman that would come at night time and terrorize people, sort of like a spirit or a jinn, as we say in the Muslim community. Um, but again, it speaks to the cultures that we come from. Um, that can also tell us about uh, our heritage, basically. And then obviously interviews, going to interview specifically, relatives to get information. But in terms of these stories, and in terms of slavery, um, and that period, it's important to note that registration for that community only really started post the turn of the 19th century. And before that, you had a whole lot of slaves being brought to the Cape from all over the world, forming a Creole body of Cape born people. And for the most part, we don't know exactly where they came from. But these stories help us to create a broader sense of genealogy. So, not necessarily the genealogy of my mother's father specifically, but rather knowing that, okay, this ancestor had this um, background at that time. I know they came from this community, and the general history of this community is such. For example, let's say my great great grandmother's mother was um, a slave whose mother was from the coast of Coromandel. And we know that this is the culture at the time. We can't trace our exact genealogy, but we can trace ourselves to these communities. And so the general and broader stories of those communities can then, inform as a pool to our genealogy instead of tracing exactly. And because of the frustration of not being able to trace exactly our ancestors, um, these are sometimes all that we have. And I think it's also necessary to, I don't want to say be grateful, but rather um, surrender yourself to that fact at that time. Never stop searching, but just understand that sometimes, just knowing that they're from this community um, is okay. Yeah. So just some examples that I'd like to go through um, for this. I'm just checking the time. Some examples that I'd like to go through, just to show primary sources from my research. How do we know uh, that I'm not talking from my thumb? you know, um, Over here on the left, we've got the CJ, the Court of Justice, Banditen role that I mentioned, and this is called the Lijst der Robben-Eiland, which started in the 1700s. It was a compilation of convicts kept on Robben Island. Here you see Europeanen afgegaan, so we know that there were Europeans kept on the island. Um, and there were also Indianen or Indians, were not necessarily actually Indians, but referred to non-whites that were kept on the island. So even, pardon this word, but Hottentotte or the Khoi um, were also referred to as Indianen, people from different places in India, also people from the Cape born but were not white. Um, and also people from Indonesia and those places were also mentioned. So I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, um, but and I'm also not sure how well you can see, but uh, above European and afgegaan number, I can't make out the number, but the last entry was Dirk Hottentot. And we can see that he was born at Cabo, the Cape, exiled from the Cape, and that was the year 1774, right? And here we can see, a Cape-born Khoi person that was exiled onto Robben Island. Here we've also got Jefta Slaaf van den Land, something, I can't make out that surname, but he came from Sumbawa. And there's all these different people. Here, these two individuals, Ratu Bagus Udin and Ratu Bagus Nassar, both came from Bantam, exiled to Batavia and then to the Cape for 25 years in 1773, right? And so the similarity of naming and title use, Ratu and Bagus, sometimes denotes the fact that they were related. We know that they were of royal or at least court adversarial origin, and it's possible that they were brothers. And so we can use this information to try and trace their genealogy moving back. Obviously, you would also, if you're doing your own genealogy, have to first trace yourself to these individuals. But once you have, these lists are useful in then tracing back. Also, just to note where they came from. For example, here, Noriman Mohammedaanse priester, he came from Cheribon, and then was sent to Batavia and then to the Cape. He is one of the kramats or shrines or graves of a saint in our community, and he's buried in Bokap in the Tanabaru. There are many stories about him, even a paper published about him. But we know that he is a kramat in our community, but we can then go back to these documents to try and trace where he came from exactly. We also know that he was sent here with his daughter and two sons, which actually proved to be nephews, and that he had a adopted son by the name of Christian Mahmoud, who was possibly his grandnephew, great nephew, or his grandson. But it's using all of this information, putting it together. Over here we've got your Ratergemeente manumissions. I just want to speak to this one here in the middle. Massie van der Kaap heeft vertoond een vrybrief op den 21ste Julie 1808 door Hout gepasseerd waarby sy uit slawerny geëmancipeerd is. So this individual, Massie van der Kaap, was emancipated by Mr. Hout, who was the owner, on the 21st of July 1808, and it's basically noting in this civic board that she had received her vrybrief or emancipation certificate. Massie is the wife of the earlier Abdul Sukur of Plain Street that had the horse and cart business. And in 1816, we later see that she actually was acquiring a license to open up her own little trading store. Maybe she was selling vegetables or general amenities. But it was quite useful, to find these documents to tell the full story of these individuals. Here we've got a CAC court case. I was researching the first Imam of Wynberg by the name of Badruddin. There is a talk online about his life, but from this court case where he was accused of receiving stolen goods, there is one mention of the little boy Iftakhuddin mentioned in the examination is the grandson of the prisoner Badruddin. Now, Badruddin had no death notice, he had no will, he had no estate, no liquidation account, no registrations, nothing at all except for these court cases, right? And so we knew nothing about his life and his family except for in this court case we find the first mention that we know he had a grandson by the name of Iftakhuddin, which is probably Niftakhuddin, which is a popular Muslim name at the Cape at the time. And nearby in Claremont there pops up a family with a surname of Badruddin or Badruddin. And so, through more investigation, it appeared that this family was actually the descendants of the said Imam Badruddin, the first Imam of Wynberg. Over here, we've got a NCD. I'd actually forgotten to put this on the original list of archival documents, um, but the NCD is your notarial collection. Under NCD, you also find wills as well, so 3 sources of different wills. Um, and in this NCD, these are requests. And this one we can see is from Opierenden, 1 November 1796. So it's the 1st of November 1796. Um, I think the notary was here, Johannes Daniel Karrensbeck. And basically, what it was about is that over here, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, you probably can't make out the script either, but basically it's about this individual named Abdus van der Kaap, so a Cape born individual, being requested by his father Kardus van Kochim. Let's see if you can read in the first paragraph on 1, 2, 3, line 4. At the end of line 4, it says getuigende vrygegevene Kardus van Kochim. And then in the second paragraph, line 1, 2, 3, zijn zoon Abdus van der Kaap, ten einde aan het kledermakers ambacht. It was a request by Kardus of Kochim, who was a freed slave that had come from Kochi in India, for his son Abdus of the Cape to become a what's the term? I can't get to the word, but basically learn the trade of a kleerdermaker, of a tailor at the time. For a period of 6 years, as it's mentioned there. Tyd van 6 jaar. And why this is useful is that in the will of Kardus and his wife Thea van der Kaap, there are no children mentioned at all. And here we've got one document, one random document of a request in the NCD, where he is requesting something for his son, Abdus van der Kaap. And now we know he has a child by the name of Abdus. His full name was probably Abdus Salam or something like that, shortened to Abdus. And in other documents, we also know that he had a daughter by the name of Mami van Kardus. So here we see a naming system where the child is given the epithet of their parents. So Mami van Kardus, Mami dochter van Kardus. So Mami, the daughter of Kardus, of Kochim. And I'd recently been researching Mami herself, who is the matriarch of, the Muslims will know this family quite well, the Murat family of Paul. But Mami is the matriarch of this. And so Kardus is her father. And now we can see that Mami actually had a brother by the name of Abdus van der Kaap. So, these small tidbits here and there really help to build the fuller picture of these people. A further one, also in RDG, is the census. So I mentioned, you've got your opgaafrollen census, your taxation census, and then you've got the civic census that exist in the Raad der Gemeente. Again, in the middle of this one, we see 3 individuals, Abdullah, Badin, and Abdul Majid. Again, I'm not sure if you can make out, but Abdullah is 28 years old, Badin is 35, and Abdul Majid is 15. They're all living on the Kaap. They live in Seestraat. Seestraat was, it still technically exists, was off Strand Street, and it was there was a lot of fishermen cottages in Seestraat, and so a lot of the people, the early free blacks, were fishermen, most of them, that had lived there. But we noticed that these 3 individuals all lived at number 10. See, they all together, and then they were in Wijk 13, in Ward 13, all these people. But here, the fact that all of them lived at number 10, Seestraat, means that there was some sort of affinity to each other. And through further research, we then find that Badin was actually the father of Abdul Majid. And we can actually see the age differential, where Badin is 35, Abdul Majid is 15. There's a 20-year difference between the two of them. And I believe Bedin, his occupation was actually, he was a basket maker at the time. He wasn't quite a fisherman, but perhaps his father was, or some connection, which is why he had lived there at the time. But here we can see how a census, although not directly indicating familial relation, but them living close together, coupled with other documents, can assist us in tracing their genealogy. Over here, we've got a Colonial Office emancipation request, and this one is from 1809, and it's by an individual named Caspar Schuchart. Caspar Schuchart was a German immigrant that had come in the late 18th century, and he was a Lutheran, and it appeared that he had taken well, not appeared, it's quite fact that he had taken a slave concubine by the name of Sunting, and he had quite a number of children from her, all who took the surname of Schuchart. However, here, apart from Sunting and her children, we see the request by Caspar Schuchart to emancipate het slavenmeisie genaamd Johanna Casperina van der Kaap, the enslaved girl named Johanna Casperina van der Kaap, right? So we don't know quite yet what the reason for this. And just to note, it says for the somme van 200 Rijksdaalders, for 200 Rijksdaalders, which was the currency of the Cape at the time, is what he emancipated her for. We don't know the exact relationship between Johanna Casperina and Caspar Schuchart, but the fact that her second name, Casperina, matched Caspar's name usually indicates that there is some sort of either relation or connection between the two of them, apart from just being his slave. What was the rationalization behind emancipating her? So it's actually quite likely that this Johanna Casperina van der Kaap was another daughter of Caspar Schuchart from perhaps a previous concubine or enslaved mistress that he had at the time. Just some more information fascinating about Caspar Schuchart is that he did not have a death notice. I think he died shortly after this, 1809. But in there he lists, his wife, Saint Byset, his concubine, Sunting van der Kaap, and he lists his slave children, Caspar II, and Louisa and Johanna and some of the other children were all still enslaved because their mother was still a slave at the time, right? And then he lists it lists his inventory. He had a mattress, he had a gun, he also had a gold pocket watch. And what's fascinating is that he says that his wife and children are all of his heirs. So despite being enslaved, they had inherited, they inherited a gold pocket watch as an enslaved person, from their free father at the time, which was not very common thing to do. And he obviously also must have had a relationship with the slave owner at the time to do this, because usually the property of the slave is also the property of the slave owner. So they must have, had some agreement. He was living around the corner from their slave owners, what's the name of the surname? I can't get to the name of their surname. The Clark family in Old Boomstraat, which is now Corporation Street. At the time, he had been living in Koffiesteeg or Coffee Lane by then. So we've finished our examples for all of those sources. We are now on to some of the methods that are used in doing this research. Again, most people, I'm sure 90% of people are quite familiar with this, but I thought it's important for me to detail, my own methodology and my rationality behind finding some of these things, which when we go to our case studies, you'll see, how something which is usually, common knowledge, used in different ways and different types of thinking, specifically contextually, can, uncover, traces without a trace, basically. So first we've got Google, uh, not the best method, but sometimes just typing in a name of someone that you're looking for, particularly if it's a rare enough name and some keywords like Cape of Good Hope, Cabo, Slaaf, Slaven, Leefeigen, or slave in Dutch, these different terms. Or if they were immigrants to the Cape, their place of birth, Hesse, and so on, can sometimes pull up um, transcriptions online that have not been cataloged properly, or you have not thought to look in those catalogs. And so sometimes some shipping registers, some requests, sometimes family trees even pop up with that. And then websites. So not just doing random Google, but actually going to websites that have these things transcribed, like Heather McAllister's ancestors website, where she actually transcribed like some of these almanacs, some slave manuals. She did a lot of work. Um, I think she used some of Professor Robert Schell's um, work also on there. I could be mistaken. Um, but a lot of those transcriptions, we've also got online family trees that exist on Genie, on Ancestry, on MyHeritage. Again, be careful because a lot of them are inaccurate, very inaccurate, sometimes um, shockingly inaccurate. And so you have to double check each and every single person, each and every single source. But just having it, is sometimes very useful in, uncovering missing people. Um, and, using all of these things in conjunction. There's also NAES. I pronounce it as NAES. You may pronounce it however you like. There might be a Cape slang way of pronouncing it. I don't know. But the NAAIRS is the National Automated Archives Retrieval System, something like that. You can just Google it. And it's basically an online catalog of many things in the archive. So it's not just of the Western Cape archives, but all the archives in the country, even some libraries as well, some private collections too, depending on where you click. And it's references on how to obtain certain documents. So you go into there, you type in keywords, and you'll see it's at this archive, this library. Most genealogists are familiar with that. And then also obviously family search, which is probably what I use the most. In fact, in the case studies, I use 90% of the images is from family search. Family search is basically scans of documents from different archives around the world, particularly of South African documents. It's highly, it's a lot of stuff from the archive. Some stuff I probably might never have found at the archives, which are scanned and put onto family search. The only danger with family search is that often it's unreferenced, and so you've got like in the middle of a book all these documents, all these names, and you don't know how to find it at the archives to find if there's a larger collection of this, and so on. So that is, your desktop research. Then I say your field research, going into the field for the sake of genealogy, always fun for us. Going to the cemeteries, just going there and looking at graves where your ancestors are buried, and searching and looking. Similarly to going through archival documents, going to the informal archive and physically moving, looking for the graves, and eventually either finding a grave of someone that you are related to, or someone that you're researching, or a connection, something. It's always the most exciting thing. And then obviously you've got private collections. I mentioned the Braintrust Baines earlier, or the Braintrust rather. Your libraries like your National Library, your archives, and then your elders for your oral histories. Again, I know most of us here are quite au fait with all of these different types, but I would say it's rather the rationality behind using some of these sources, and not the sources itself, that can help us research further. Sometimes being aware of the context that they found themselves in, and patterns within their context, as we will discover shortly. Okay, so onto our case studies. I'll go through the case study of George Dundas Baumgardt. The Baumgardt family supposedly traced themselves to one Johannes Pieter Baumgardt, who came from Wrocław, which is current day in Poland. I think it was him or his father. Can't remember exactly right now. But they had come from Wrocław. He settled at the Cape. He married locally. I am getting a bit confused with the generations, but I think it was, yeah, Johannes Pieter is the son of the guy that came, right? And Johannes Pieter came to the Cape and married into the very popular Van Reenen family, a granddaughter of the Count Van Reenen, who came from Lithuania. And over here, we've actually got a sketch of his wife, Johanna Baumgardt nie Van Reenen. And this was a sketch done by Lady Anne Barnard in her diary, the diary of Lady Anne Barnard. She was, good friends with the Baumgardts at the time. So they had quite a number of children. However, from Lady Anne Barnard's diary, we can see on the top left-hand corner, Mrs. Baumgardt had affairs with several members of the British garrison at the Cape and was at the time involved with General Dundas. So now we know that despite being married to Johannes Pieter Baumgardt, she was having a number of affairs at that time. And if we go to baptismal registers in the church records, all of her children are registered as the children of Johanna van Reenen and Johannes Pieter Baumgardt. However, when we read further in the diary of Lady Anne Barnard, it says Mrs. Baumgardt, as usual, showed the same restless anxiety to have, I can't read exactly now, but the general placed himself next to her. And if we just move down, how strange it is that eager desire, what. Oh, there we go. Is it not enough if a woman have a little boy to a general? So here we can see, in the diary, Lady Anne Barnard alludes to the fact that Johanna, apart from everybody knowing she was having all these affairs, she had a child from the general himself, which was this General Henry Dundas, who eventually became governor at the Cape around that period as well. And when we go to the death notice of some of her children, we can see here George Dundas Baumgardt, who was registered as a child of Johanna and Johannes Pieter Baumgardt, is given the name George Dundas Baumgardt. And further reading eventually tells us that he was in fact the illegitimate child of this woman in the middle, and General Dundas, governor of the Cape. But the story does not end there. So over here it says he was born at the Cape of Good Hope. His parents are both dead, but we now know who they are. He was 61 years of age when he died. He was unmarried. I think it said government functionary, and he died on the 4th of October 1852 at his residence in the village of Clan William. And then he had some losse goedere or immovable property at the time. But what's curious is that it said that he was unmarried and had no children, right? If we go to the next section on your right hand side, it's very blurred, but it's a death notice of another Baumgardt that found himself in Cape Town at the time. And here we see Edward George Baumgardt, born in Cape Town, the son of George Dundas Baumgardt. So over here, George Dundas Baumgardt, so it says unmarried, no children. And here we see that he actually did have a son by the name of Edward George Baumgardt, and the mother's name was Wilhelmina Baumgardt, right? He was 52, he was a carpenter, a widower. He died in 1880, I think it was actually, 1888. He lived in Kapini Street, and he had like all these kids and immovable properties and so on. So, it then raises the question, why did it say that he had no children? Why in his LND account, in his will and so on, no children are mentioned, anything like that? Yet, on this Edward, the parents' names are clearly given. And there was only one George. It was quite a unique name. There was only one George Dundas Baumgardt at the Cape at the time. That then brings us to searching for other documents. So here we've got another church record, one that was done at the St. George's Cathedral and Anglican Church in 1853. One Thomas Coburn married a Georgina Wilhelmina Baumgardt. And here's all their details. She was a spinster, and she signs here, and it says in the presence of Wilhelmina Martina Baumgardt. Now, further research shows that Wilhelmina and Edward George were siblings, and we can infer that Georgina Wilhelmina was also a sibling of theirs at the time. Now, this then comes to the rationalization and researching in context. So we know that George Dundas did have children indeed, but they were not recognized. We know that he had a wife or a partner by the name of Wilhelmina, but there's no documentation for her at all. And further documents eventually show that these people were later on recognized as colored people. In the early days, they just would have been residents at the Cape. There wasn't much documents showing how they were perceived in terms of mixed or Malay or any of those things. But we know that their descendants were known as colored people broadly, whereas most of the other Baumgardts were recognized as white or European. And that then tells us that there is a connection to slavery at the time. Then it then comes to the mother. So we know George Dundas Baumgardt was 100% recognized as a white at the Cape, also why there are all those documents for him, his baptism and so on. Yet there's nothing for births of Georgina, Edward, Wilhelmina Martina, and so on. And so when we rationalize, we then realize that it must mean that Wilhelmina, mother of these individuals, was an enslaved woman, or at least a previously enslaved woman, a free black woman. Also, the fact that the daughters both had Wilhelmina in their names, Georgina Wilhelmina and Wilhelmina Martina, also highlights the fact of this connection to their mother, which was common at the Cape to name your children, after yourselves and family members. There was the old Dutch naming system. The fact that Edward George, has George in his name, and his father was George Dundas Baumgardt, and so on. So moving on, we know that their mother was most likely a slave, and we've got the first names, right? So in terms of slave documents, generally, you won't find second names mentioned. You'd only find the first names and no surnames. So we know that there was an Edward, we know there was a Georgina, and we know that there was a Wilhelmina, right? And their mother's name was also Wilhelmina. Now, again, in the context of slavery, their full names were not usually used. So Wilhelmina would be known as Mina, Sarah would be known as Sarki, Jacob would be known as Yapi, and so on. And then, it's a case of then trying to search for these individuals in the context that they found themselves in. And so in terms of my methodology, I then realized, okay, a more uncommon slave name would be Georgina, and the mother was probably Wilhelmina. And we can then use, over here we've got our desktop, we've got family search, we can use family search, and we can play around with how the family search website looks and how it functions. And we know that we can search for a name, and you can search for parents' names, and you can search, which catalog you want to look in. So what I had done is let's look for Georgina. Let's look if she had a mother named Mina and in the slave registers. And something popped up. Over here, we've got, this is 1816 registrations of this woman, Martha Susanna Olveg. She had three slaves by then, Eva, Mina, and David Mina in 1816 was around 3 years old. And as we move on, in I think it's like 1836, Georgina is then registered, having been born in May 1836. And if we look at the ages of Wilhelmina Martina, and we look at the age of Edward George, we know that they were all roughly born in the 30s, right? And none of those names appear on here. But we do see that Georgina is listed as a daughter of Mina, right? And so we can then infer that they were probably the same Georgina Wilhelmina Baumgardt and Wilhelmina Baumgardt herself. And then further reading then tells us, if we look here at the remarks, Mina was sold and transferred on that date in 1830 to the widow of J.P. Baumgardt, who was in fact this individual over here, Johanna Baumgardt herself. And for Georgina, it says she was then manumitted in 1830. I think it was 1831. She was manumitted, so she was just born and then manumitted. And when you go to the manumission register, she was manumitted by G.M. Baumgardt, which was in fact her father's sister. So we can see the family actually then playing a role. The brother had this concubine woman, Mina. She was having these children, Georgina, Edward, Wilhelmina, and they then felt perhaps it was their responsibility or their affinity to these children that they want to keep them in the family. And so the mother, or the grandmother rather, Johanna Baumgardt, then purchases the concubine, Mina or Wilhelmina, and frees the children. And it seems that because there's no record of enslavement for Edward, George, and Georgina Wilhelmina, they must have freed Mina at some point, and she then begot these freeborn children from her. It is very confusing, and there are a lot more documents, but just to explain, with some key documents, the rationality between eventually finding this, connection. Why I chose this one in particular is because my research hints to the fact that they had another brother named Masech who had become Muslim. His Muslim name was Masech Baumgardt. Also born around the same time, lived in the same area, everything. But his parents' names are just given as Baumgardt. And he is actually an ancestor of mine. And it probably took me around 7 years of trying to trace this family to then come to the realization that this Masech, everything is congruent, that he was probably a sibling of these individuals, a son of Wilhelmina and Edward George Baumgardt. And then furthermore, they are not actually Baumgardts. From the diary of Lady Anne Barnard, we can actually see that the father of George Dundas was in fact General Henry Dundas, which I think he was like a Scottish, of Scottish origin, was sent to the Cape as a governor. And from there on, there's a lot of information about his genealogy. But just, trying to put all of these things together and tracing them when there is no trace of their ancestors, and trying to put all of these things together. I do know it's very confusing, and it's basically, taking all of these sources, putting it into one and trying to find, how they are connected. There's probably also newspaper records that somehow tie them together, but eventually, after 7 years of searching and looking in these different documents, it all sort of came together at the end. Again, there are loose ends here and there, which, sometimes you just have to surrender yourself to the fact that you don't have something, but everything is pointing, in the right direction, and you have to make these inferences, at times. So that was our first case study of the Baumgardt family, which we now know is actually the Dundas family. Our second case study is that of Jan van Bougies, right? So Jan van Bougies was a slave that came to the Cape in the I think he came in the 1770s, early 1770s. He was brought to the Cape. His name, Jan, is obviously a slave name, and the fact that he's van Bougies, Bugis is not a place, but rather it's a people that live in Sulawesi island, live on the island of Sulawesi in present-day Indonesia, and he would have been brought captured over there somehow and being brought to the Cape as a slave and just given the generic name Jan. Um, Eventually, he went on to be a student of an earlier political exile named Imam Abdullah van Ternaten, which we call in our community Tuan Guru, master teacher, who is seen as the father and the founder and the first teacher of the present day Muslim community. You know, the community really formed from the 1790s onwards. And this Jan van Bougies was a student of that Imam. And, you know, in researching, I believe it was in the RDG, I eventually found his slave manumission. He was actually freed by his wife, Salia van Makassar. So Makassar is also on Sulawesi. So she must have had some affinity, you know, found this other person of the same region. They were married and she freed him in 1786. And he went on to become a very popular free black in the early Cape community. He went on to be part of this madrasa or this Muslim school. He joined the first community, and he, in his own right, became a teacher, a scribe, and an imam himself, right? And there was a house in Long Street that he lived in. I believe it first belonged to his first wife, Salia, and then not sure what happened to her exactly, but he remarried a woman named Samida van der Kaap, who was also the daughter of one of these free blacks who came from Southeast Asia. But Jan van Bougies lived in this house number 101 Long Street. And what they did was they then submitted an application for the use of part of this house for a Mohammedan place of worship, which is a langar. Today we call it a mosque, which still exists till today. And he was one of the first imams or Muslim priests of this mosque at the time. The only issue is we know nothing about his origin except for the fact that his name was Jan van Bougies, right? Also, if we look here on his death notice, it says name Jan van Bougies, from Bougies, parents' names unknown. He was 112 when he died. He was a Malay priest. He was married, as I mentioned, to Samida. He died in 1846 at Long Street, and he said he had no children, right? However, there is oral history from the Reikle family of Weinberg that they actually descend from one of his daughters. And so we do see some oral history in the community that there is some sort of connection to him. We also see another free black signing at the bottom there in the Jawi script in Arabic as Frans van. He was actually Frans van der Kaap, another prominent free black Muslim teacher at the time. But in researching his life, you know, he was a very prominent guy. He was involved in politics. You know, the government recognized him as a prominent individual, very charismatic, and was not afraid to challenge, you know, people even in his own community at the time if he felt that he was in the right. You know, he was a very important person to research. And it was frustrating that there was no information about him. While researching him, I found myself in the Tanah Baru, the old slave burial ground in the Boerkaap, and I came across this massive tombstone. It's probably 3/4 of my own height, and I'm like 1.8 meters tall. It's really massive, and you can see intricate designs on the top. You can see pillars on the side. You see a beautiful pomegranate tree at the bottom. Below the pomegranate, there's a staircase step. All of this is imagery of heaven that these people used, you know, when making these tombstones for aesthetic purposes and cultural purposes. But it's written in Jawi, which is the Malay language in Arabic script, though there is a lot of Arabic involved here, pure Arabic itself. And so when we just read through it, it says قوله الحق وكلامه الصدق. It's word, the speech is true and the word is correct or honest. It's basically affirming that whatever is to follow by the scribe and by the person who basically organized for this to be made is fact in their eyes, 100%. It starts with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. I bear testimony that there is only one God, which is Allah, and that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the messenger of God. Indeed, from God do we come, and unto God do we return. That says, Inila Manyatakan Muhammad bin Fadl, right? So over here, bearing in mind, I don't know who this is. It's just a tombstone in the Tanah Baru I was transcribing, right? Over here it says, this individual, his name, this is Muhammad. His name is Muhammad, son of Fadl. His father's name is Fadl. Namanya, so his name. And then the Negeri, Bone. He is from the place of Bone. Now, Bone, if we think of Sulawesi in Indonesia, it's split into like two arms, right? This island. On the left arm, that section is also split into two. So on the left hand side, you've got, on the west, you've got Makassar, which is where Jan van Bougies' first wife, Salia van Makassar, came from. And then on the right hand side, you had the Regency of Bone, right? So it's on the eastern part, or the right hand side of the western arm of Sulawesi Island in, I think, eastern Indonesia today. So we know this guy over here, Muhammad son of Fadl, came from Bone to the Cape, and then it says kemudian the Negeri Cup, so he came to the Cape menjadi Imam Hasanullah, where he's called at the Cape Imam Hasanullah. So although he had an actual birth name, Muhammad son of Fadl, at the Cape he's referred to as Imam, or Malay priest, Hasanullah, which means the beauty of God. It was not uncommon to give people, such titles at the time, particularly in the Muslim community, right? And then it says, Maningal Dunya, he has left this world. In our community till today, we still use the word Maningal to refer to when someone has died. Karahmatullah, Kanigari Baqa, he has left this world through the mercy of God to the everlasting place. And then it just gives the date that he died, which is the Javanese reckoning of the Islamic Hijri calendar, right? It's a very intricate calendar system, but he died in Dhul Qa'dah, which is the 11th month of the Hijri year, the Islamic calendar, Tiga Likar, which is the 23rd day of that month, dari bulan, pada hari Khamis, so he died on a Thursday, pada waktu subuh, in the early morning hours, so after the early morning prayer. Also, just to note here, it says pada hari Khamis, right? Khamis means 5 in Arabic, but it was the Malay pronunciation. And we start to notice that a lot of slave names were actually named, particularly Muslim slaves, were named according to the day that they were born or the month that they were born in. And so Khamis is the 5th day, a Thursday. You see a lot of slaves by the name of Kamis van der Kaap, Kamis van Batavia, Kamis van Bougies, which usually indicates that they had been born on a Thursday. Furthermore, here's the name Dhul Qa'dah. The wife of the teacher of Jan van Bougies, Imam Abdullah, his wife's name was Qa'dah, and this month that this guy died in is Dhul Qa'dah. So we know there's a month named Dhul Qa'dah, so we can infer that Tuan Guru's wife, Qa'dah, or Qaida, as she was called at the Cape, was in fact born in the month of Dhul Qa'dah. Similarly, if you live in Cape Town and you mix with the Muslim community, there's names like Saban, Saval. There used to be names like Ramalan and so on, which are all Malay pronunciations of old Arabic months. And because you were born in that month, you were named after that month. It also has to do with the old talismanic system that I mentioned earlier. Again, you're welcome to ask questions about that later on. But we can see how these months and these days within the Javanese calendar, Javanese Hijri calendar, also inform us sometimes about, the individuals themselves. But coming back to this guy, Muhammad bin Fadl, also known as Hasanullah, he died in the early morning hours in the Hijri calendar, and it says umurnya, the date that he died was 1263. So that was the Hijri year, and then it says tahun wow. So it's this scribble in maybe the last third, where it's like a scribble with like 6 dots on top of it, And that is part of that old calendar system. They use symbols to denote the different years. And then it says, Umurnia Seratus Duabelas. His age was 112 years old. So again, we don't know who this guy is. We just see a tombstone with some Arabic names and some Malay language and details in the Tanah Baru, which is really intricate and beautiful, generally of an important person, right? At the same time, this guy, Jan van Bougies, is being researched, but there's no logical connection between them quite yet. That then brings us to kitabs. So we are using now different archives. We're using the colonial archive for the death notice and slave documents. We're using the cemetery for the tombstone. This then brings us to the kitabs, which are collections kept in families, right? So it says here, وَصَاحِبُ هَذَا kitab Imam Ismail. So the owner of this kitab is Imam Ismail. This was an imam that was also imam of the mosque in Long Street in the 1870s. And this kitab is actually kept by his descendants. They bear the same surname till today. They have like a massive collection of texts, even written by Jan van Bougies himself. But it says the owner of this kitab is Imam Ismail fi baladi Kab in
stay co-host, or do you want to be host? Game host.
fi baladi Kab in the land of the Cape, so Cape Town, and it says Masjidul Imam Hasnullah Muhammad bin Fadl. In the masjid or in the mosque of Imam Hasnullah Muhammad bin Fadl. And this is the crucial mentioning here. This guy, Imam Ismail, is an imam of a mosque, and he refers to the mosque as being the mosque of Imam Hasnullah Muhammad bin Fadl. We go to this tombstone, it's the tombstone of Hasnullah, also whose birth name is Muhammad bin Fadl. So we know that this guy here is the mosque that this Ismail was the mosque of this guy, Muhammad bin Fadl, Hasnullah. And if we go to other documents in the archives, we know that this mosque in Long Street, which was known as the Palm Tree Mosque because there are palm trees outside, was also known as the mosque of Jan van Bougies and the mosque of Asnoon. Asnoon being a shortening nickname of Hasnullah. But this is how we put together that this individual, Jan van Bougies, who only had a slave identity in terms of colonial perception, the community knew exactly who he was. They knew he had a title, Hasnullah. They knew his name was Muhammad. They even knew his father's name all the way back in Bone in Indonesia. And the fact that on his tombstone it says Bone, he obviously did not commission his own tombstone. Somebody around him that was close to him must have commissioned it and known that he was born in Bone. So we can see that in the community's archive and the community's knowledge, all of these facts about him was well known. He died 1846. This document was written, or this kitab was written in like the 1870s. So 30 years after his death, he was still remembered by his full name, by his title, every day. And again, it says, Yawm al-Khamis. So again, this was also written on the 5th day, a Thursday. Can't make that out. But it says Thanata Ashar, which is, Maqrat Thanata Ashar, which is the 12th, I think the 12th chapter of the Quran. The Malay understanding of Arabic was a bit different at the time, and it was written during the midday prayer, Waqtu Dhuhr. And here at the bottom, very interesting, it says, Lang Straat Mi'aita Wahid number. Long Street, Mi'aita Wahid, Arabic for 101 number. So we know that he listed as number 101 Long Street, the mosque of Imam Hasnullah Muhammad bin Fadl. That is what the mosque was known as, and that he is the imam of this mosque. And so when we use all of this information all together, oral history, kitabs, tombstones, the death notices, slave records, and also the context and rationality of the the trials of slavery and the erasure of identity colonially, and we put it all together, we are able to reconstruct the identities of these individuals, which further assists us in trying to trace their own ancestry. My own research actually shows that Muhammad bin Fadl, his father, was um, I wouldn't say royal, but of high status over in Borneo, and the research is still ongoing of this guy, Fadl himself.
I have a question. First of
Sure.
all, thank you. It was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed every minute. Have you had anything to do with the archives in Belgium and in Holland? And also the Indian archives? I'll tell you why. I have a family that come from that area. In fact, a great uncle who married into the royal family there in Western, and I was able to get a lot of information from Holland. And funny enough, the Belgian archives also have perhaps more details. Have you ever sought them?
I have used the Dutch archive. Fortunately, I think most of, especially Dutch East India archival documents have been scanned and put online on the, I think it's the Hague's, the National Archive, I think archief.nl, on their website. And so I have actually gone through some of those. There's a new feature for those that are interested and do use it, is that they've employed AI technology to transcribe a lot of the documents. And so now there's a very easy search engine where you type in your interested name, and the documents that contain that name that have been transcribed pops up, and you can do further research using that. In terms of the Indian as well as Indonesian archives, unfortunately, it's very difficult to use that, particularly remotely. If you go there, especially in India, it is very difficult to make use of their archive. I've done research not using the archives. I've done research on how to use the archives, and even that was an incredibly complicated process, just understanding the process of getting there and requesting permission to view the documents, and then using the archives, and then also trying to understand how the archives work, understanding that a lot of the documents are written in Tamil scripts, Devanagari, Hindi scripts, Persian, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, and thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. Which of the formal records are available online?
So I think you'd find them on Family Search. I would say almost all of your death notices from its inception in 1836 until at least 1959 roughly are available on Family Search. It has been scanned. I have found that some of them were just missed in the scanning, so you'd have to go to the archive. So sometimes you're going through the collection online and it's just not there, but it is actually at the archives. It's not that it disappeared. Also, those ward master returns, so births from the 1840s, I found is on there. The almanacs are online, as I mentioned. Ancestor.co.za has a lot of these transcriptions, not the actual documents. If I just actually go back to the list to see, so I can point out. So it would be your death notices. Then there are wills before 1800 that are online. Births for 1895 only are online. A lot of marriages, a lot of your church records are actually online. Deaths from 1895 onwards, and births are all online up until 1960. None of the memorials and petitions are online. However, there are requests to leave and enter the colony, which are online. None of your RDGs. In terms of your court cases, you will find the Cape Times summaries of some of these court cases are online, just published randomly on Google. That's why I said, just Google things, and you might just find it popping up. There's also another website called the Internet Archive, which has a lot of publications and books that randomly someone posted online and was grabbed and stored on this Internet Archive. And you can search titles or you search keywords, and publications containing these will start to pop up. In fact, the opgaafrollen are also online. You can find that there are a lot of, not all, but a lot of slave office documents. Not quite the manumissions, a few, but most slave registrations are online. None of your CJs are online at all, I think. There are, I mentioned the archief.nl, they've got some CJ files from that side. So if you understand, like the Dutch East India Archive, you have the Cape Colony, you've got the base in the Netherlands, you've got Dutch India, you've got Batavia. Each of those had their own archives. And so there are duplicates and sometimes more detailed of all of these documents here in some of the other archives if there's a connection to them. So for example, some of these banditenrollen, some of the World's finds, for example, involve people from Southeast Asia, from India, from the Netherlands, and so you will find duplicates over in the Netherlands, and you go through those online sources, and you can actually find it online. Sometimes it's a lot easier than going through, like I remember for the World's MWC, there is a collection from, I think, 1800 something until like 1833 of unregistered wills, which most people don't know about. These wills were drawn up, submitted, but not registered. So it just went into this limbo. There's also no catalog for them. So there's catalogs for death notes for all these documents, most of them, but the wills were just kept together. And so going through it was time consuming. I'm doing like this A, B, C, D, E, F, and section 1, 2, 3, whatever. But going through it takes a lot of time, going through it, hoping you'll find something. Luckily, I did actually, like, a lot of information. But these online sources, particularly where it has been transcribed, it's a massive help and time saver. And sometimes with the new technologies, like I mentioned in that case study of the Baumgardt, where you can search the daughter and the mother together, it's really helpful. And then the formal sources, in terms of newspapers, the National Library does have an online database where there is scans of some Cape Times, some Cape Standard, some other newer newspapers from late 1800s, early 1900s. I think the Lantern, the Cape Indian, and a few others. And then UCT website, if you are a student or a lecturer or connected, you can figure something out. UCT has a brilliant online database of most of these. In fact, it's an African newspaper database. So it's newspapers from all over Africa that have been scanned online. You can search keywords and it's been transcribed with AI, or you can just go to it and find the actual pages. I mentioned the almanacs, many of them, not all, are online. And then a lot of your church records, particularly baptisms and memberships, are online. I think Wits University published the St. George's Cathedral baptisms, so you'd have to go to the website to get that. Memberships are on Family Search. Some marriages too. Pensions, you'd have to go to the archives to get. And yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thanks so much.
No problem.
Daiyaan, thank you very much for a most interesting talk. It's certainly given us more insight with more interesting concepts that maybe some of us didn't have thought of before. It certainly taught this old dog some new tricks, and for that I thank you very much. I enjoyed your the bedtime story. My children of a terrible thing that we used to have read to them called School Peter, and it was the most terrible stories that used to happen if you were naughty. But thank you very much, and thank you for all those that have listened. It's been very, very informative and very interesting, and I hope we see lots more of you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really appreciative of all of you, and thanks to everybody that has joined. I do hope it was beneficial to some of you at least. I know, again, it's a lot of old information, but yeah, thanks again.